Very often at ODSECS sessions, somebody other than me does the introduction, but for various reasons today, I'm going to do it, and that gives me a very particular privilege, actually. I'm very thrilled to be doing it. I want to welcome to our seminar Dr. Angelina Del Balzo, who's Assistant Professor of Humanities in the programme in Cultures, Civilizations and Ideas at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. In 2019, Angelina received her PhD in English with a concentration in gender studies from UCLA, and she's had her work published in 18th century fiction, 18th century studies, and in SEL, Studies in English Literature, 1500 to 1900. And in addition to her wonderful academic work, she's also served as a scriptreader and a dramaturg with the theatre at Boston Court in Pasadena. And you, ODSECS attendees, could read so much on the internet, but it's my privilege as chair to go behind the scenes a little bit and to find out what our speakers are like as friends and as well as scholars. And I'm very thrilled that two of Angelina's great friends and supporters were happy to share with me some sense of what she's like as a person as well as a scholar. So I'm really grateful to Taylor Wall, who's a friend of Angelina's from graduate school, who wrote to tell me that Angelina is extremely sharp. She is always able to cut right to the heart of an argument. At our beloved Southern California 18th century group, Angelina would ask some of the most insightful questions at any presentation, even as a first-year graduate student, even with veteran 18th century scholars like Felicity Nussbaum and Max Novak in the room. Angelina is bold, confident in her opinions, and can hold her own in any context. And what's more, she loves what she does. When I first met her, she and a group of friends from college were reading Clarissa for fun. I miss her, and I wish I could be there for this presentation. And Helen Deutsch, who was one of Angelina's doctoral advisors, wrote to tell me that Angelina is much missed at UCLA for many reasons. Her brilliance, her humour, her kindness, her generosity and collegiality. But above all, we miss her eloquence and her exceptional ability to ask the best questions at any talk she attends. She elevates every scholarly conversation that she joins. Angelina won't be asking the questions today, but she will be answering them later on. And it's my very great privilege then to welcome Angelina and to introduce her talk, the title of which is 18th Century Tragedy and the Formation of Whiteness. Over to you, Angelina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Buller, for that generous introduction, for the opportunity to give this talk today. Sorry, let me pull up my slides. And thanks to Taylor and Helen for very touching intro and also slightly embarrassing. Okay, so I hope everyone can see my screen. Okay. Sorry, I'm a little unfamiliar. Thank you. Okay, I'm a little unfamiliar with this format. Okay, yes. So I would also just like to give a content warning for some racist language and discussion of sexual assault in this talks. And that given that I am presenting about whiteness, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that I am talking today from occupied Tongva land in the Los Angeles basin, and that no group representing the Tongvan people has been recognized as a tribe by the United States federal government. But during the academic year, however, I live and work in central Anatolia, the capital and spiritual home of the Republic of Turkey. While the origins of this project predate my move to Ankara, my life and work there have given new immediacy to this project. It was in Turkey where I first saw blackface performance live at a state opera production of Verdi's Aida. Apropos to this project, while most Ethiopian characters on stage had some sort of racial prosthetic as part of their costume, the titular heroine did not, thus remaining unmarked visually and coded as white. I knew that some European productions of Othello still featured the lead singer in blackface, but I was naively perhaps surprised to see it in Aida, and maybe also because I was in a country often thought of in North America as non-European or even non-white. If I thought this was an anomaly, I was certainly disabused by that impression when I taught Othello for the first time that following spring. My introductory lecture was already turning out to be more intense than normal. After what I hoped was successfully navigating the Scylla question from a student about Shakespeare's potential homosexuality, I ran into the Charybdis from the same student when he shared that in his high school production of Othello, they used blackface makeup in its costuming. But that it wasn't racist because there are not many black people in Turkey, and it is therefore necessary for in the interest of realism. Other students in my class agreed, many assuming that blackface in Turkey is different than what I understand to be as an American. Interestingly, and I doubt coincidentally, the only student who vocalized an opinion that this blackface still resulted from and participated in the racist history of racial performance was a Palestinian student. I bring up this example from the classroom in a somewhat long introduction to my talk for a couple of reasons. The first is to reiterate the relational nature of whiteness, especially in the way that racial prosthetics are gendered. And then second, that the Mediterranean Middle Eastern triangulation of race that I discuss in this talk is certainly not unique to the 18th century moment. While much of my argument at this point focuses on the debates around genre in the period, it is a reminder that race and gender are not incidental to the categorization of tragedy, but definitional. While the history of whiteness is long and nonlinear, the 18th century must be a crucial period for any understanding of the construction of race, particularly in the Anglo-American world, where the transatlantic slave trade was controlled at its peak, and when Britain started looking towards the Middle East and South Asia for conquest. 18th century theater often conflated blackness with the Oriental subject. Repertorial performances of Thomas Southern's 1696 adaptation of Aphra Behn's Oroonoko and Shakespeare's Othello, along with Osman and Aaron Hill's later The Tragedy of Zara, blended the theatrical figure of the Black and the Oriental. The discourse of abolition the discourse of abolition separated the Oriental and the Black, allowing the paradoxical expansion of empire at the end of the transatlantic slave trade. For example, in the 18th century version of the Arabian Nights, Aladdin initially believes the genie to be his uncle, suggesting ethnic commonality. As the abolition movement grew in the 19th century, however, depictions of the genie transformed him into a fully racialized African, associating the character with enslaved labor. Roxanne Wheeler has identified the 1770s as the cultural moment when racialized discourse around white and Black supplanted the Christian heathen dichotomy that is often invoked in Oriental drama and narratives, but also how the way in which English discourse was in no way consistent in these descriptions. In 18th century parlance, for example, East and West Indians, Indonesians, Persians, and others were Black, and in contemporary Australia and New Zealand, Commonwealth nations initially colonized in the late 18th century, Black is still often used to describe Aboriginal people, not just or even primarily people from the African diaspora. Thanks in part to the first appearances of actresses on the English language stage in 1660, tragedies centered on the deaths of white women were central to British theater, even as tragic Black women were omitted or erased. The rise of the actress is inextricable with the development of whiteness, beginning with the first unnamed actress to perform in the English stage in 1660, who appeared as Desdemona in Othello. In this talk, I will triangulate the Oriental tragedy and she tragedy with the nascent discourse of whiteness and race. So first, I will briefly cover she tragedy and the rise of the actress, particularly how it relates to Othello and the Tragedy of Zara. Then, by way of example, I will show how the pivotal Oriental tragedy, the Siege of Rhodes, is structured around the hallmarks of she tragedy, and how that complicates our understanding of their performance of difference on the Restoration stage. And then finally, I will gesture towards how the she and Oriental tragedy contributes to consolidating discourse around race and whiteness in the stage adaptation of Oroonoko, where Southerne famously changes Aphra Behn's enslaved African woman character into a white woman. Restoration tragedy, in contrast to its more familiar early modern counterparts, is defined by the emotion performed on stage and affected by its audience, rather than on aesthetic or formal qualities. As Laura Brown contends, 17th century tragedy is not centered on Aristotelian hubris, but rather brings pathos to the forefront. The focus on affect unites the various tragic genres of the later 17th century. The representation of affect is crucial to heroic, Oriental, domestic, and she tragedy. The tragic focus is not on an inner conflict or flaw brought to disaster by action, but on external factors that create space for the performance of emotion. So she tragedy is a subgenre of tragedy that is arguably the exemplar of the emphasis on pathos. The term was coined in 1714 by the maestro of the form Nicholas Rowe, author of The Fair Penitent and the Tragedy of Jane Shore. At the end of the trend for new plays in the genre, though many were popular revived properties throughout the 18th century. In Jean Marsden's formulation, she tragedy is the specifically gendered genre of affect and spectacle. The defining characteristic of the genre, this obsession with tainted female sexuality, constitutes a technology of gender in which female sexuality is both demonized and defined as a treasure for homosocial exchange. And I think this is very evocative of the relationship of Desdemona to Iago, Cassio, and Othello, for example. In these plays, the woman does not control her own sexuality. Rather, possession of her body is fought over and displayed by the play's male characters. In the semiotics of she tragedy, control of a woman's sexuality is marked by control of the gaze, and the she tragedy heroine spends much of her time on stage subjected to a gaze explicitly defined as male. So the genre is defined through two different categories: the characteristics of the heroine and the external response to her, both on stage and from the audience. She tragedy makes female distress both an erotic and a sentimental spectacle. While the audience gaze may be theorized as male, women also love she tragedy and their heroines. Theater historians and critics have argued that Restoration tragedy initially consisted primarily of the Oriental tragedy and the heroic drama, while the she tragedy developed beginning in the 1680s after women became more successful as performers, retaining popularity until the 1710s, accelerated by the triumph of arguably the greatest performer of the period, Elizabeth Barry. But the examples of tragedies that emphasize female pathos, however, predate the late 1670s start given by critics. The role of Ianthe in The Siege of Rhodes, which I will discuss at length, is often cited as a precursor to she tragedy, beginning with Mary Betterton's star performance in 1662, the same year that the casting of women actors in women's parts became law. The part was originated, however, by Catherine Coleman in Davenant's clandestine performance of the original first part in 1656 during the interregnum, suggesting that the origins of she tragedy predate even the reopening of the theaters. Reading a famous Oriental drama as a she tragedy not only recenters women in the philosophic debates around tragedy, but its foreign settings also foreground the ways in which the seemingly domestic she tragedy participates in the racialization of women's suffering. And I can certainly talk more, as I've done elsewhere, about what it is about a lot of these Oriental tragedies that relate to she tragedy more broadly. But obviously, I will have a much more narrow focus here. And unlike other more infamous 18th century Shakespeares, Othello was performed relatively unaltered in the Restoration and throughout the 18th century, and was still the fifth most frequently performed Shakespeare play. This may be because structurally it already shared much in common with the Oriental tragedy and the she tragedy of the period, unlike plays similarly popular but performed mostly in adaptation like Romeo and Juliet and Richard III. Othello's settings, themes, and plot include Oriental settings, Cyprus, and to some extent Venice, a conflict with the Ottoman Empire, a jealous lover, and a woman whose distress and suffering is at the core of the tragedy. And these are all characteristics later taken up by the Siege of Rhodes and the Tragedy of Zara. Famously, the prologue and epilogue introducing the actors to the English stage conflate the unnamed actress performing as Desdemona with the character of Desdemona, linking the professional female performer's gender with racialized performance. I will briefly focus on the epilogue after the performance, which does two things. One, it contrasts the white Desdemona with the blackness of Othello, and two, it reconfigures the actress as what would later be recognized as a she tragic heroine. Quote, "How do you like her? Come, was it to you drive at? She's the same thing in public and in private. As far from being what you call a whore, as Desdemona injured by the Moor. Then he that censures her in such a case hath a soul blacker than Othello's face. But ladies, what think you? For if you tax her freedom with dishonor to your sex, she means to act no more, and this shall be no other play but her own tragedy. She will submit to none but your commands, and take commission only from your hands. So the actress's performance as Desdemona is elided as the figure of the actress herself becomes Desdemona, her gender inextricable from her complexion. Similarly, if her performance is not successful, the tragedy of the Moor of Venice becomes the tragedy of the actress, as her failure means that no more actresses will feature on the stage. A similar conflation will happen later with Susanna Cibber's performance as Zara, as described in Colley Cibber's prologue. Cibber's prologue to Zara, spoken by himself, emphasizes the potential for identification with the actress rather than the character she plays. Quote, "When a chaste heart's distress your grief demands, one silent tear outweighs 1,000 hands. If she conveys the pleasing passion's right, guard and support her this decisive night. If she mistakes or finds her strength too small, let interposing pity break her fall. In you at rest to save her or destroy. If she draws tears from you, I weep for joy." While, of course, Cibber has an interest in promoting Susanna Cibber's performance, as his daughter-in-law, over the tragic character, this prologue describes an active spectator that is common in descriptions of theatrical affect. In this construction of shared sentiment, theatrical affect is exchanged through tears. Tears of sorrow from the audience's sympathy with the tragic subject will elicit tears of joy from the performers and the authors after the fact. Tears are, allegedly in here, an involuntary corporeal effect of sympathy, and thus the more desirable from rapt spectators than applause, the audience's voluntary expression of approval. The prologue to Zara positions identification with the actress over the character. The active performance is the central emotional pull rather than the plot. While the text of plays like Othello and Zara follow the format of the she tragedy as described by Marsden in many ways, the prologues and epilogues show the actress herself to be a she tragic heroine. Her performance as the heroine could result in a symbolic death at the hands of the audience. Not only is she tragedy one of the dominant modes of English tragedy, full stop, but the actress as a category is a she tragic heroine, performing pathos for performance. And from the beginning, even before the 1660 Othello, with the 1656 Siege of Rhodes, is a performance that is marked by ethnic and or religious difference. The tragedy of Zara was often compared with Othello by contemporary commentators. Zara's narrative makes the comparison easy. So Zara is a Christian captive caught between her loyalties to her family and her love for the Sultan Osman. Osman ultimately stabs his betrothed Zara from jealousy, only to commit suicide when his mistake becomes known. Voltaire's Zaire, translated by Aaron Hill as The Tragedy of Zara, was written after Voltaire's exile in England, where he was a regular attendant of the theater. He would go on to incorporate elements of English tragedy as interpreted by Shakespeare in his own work. In the London Intelligencer, Zara is inscribed as a national property both through Hill's involvement and through Voltaire's knowledge of the British. Quote, "Zara is borrowed originally from the Zaire of Monsieur de Voltaire, an author who, while he resided in England, imbibed so much of British liberty that his writings seemed almost calculated for the meridian of London. Mr. Aaron Hill, however, has made this, as well as his own, that it is hard to determine which of the two may most properly be called the author of this play." End quote. The Tragedy of Zara gives a material reality to the heroine's negotiation of religious and national interests, making an internal struggle legible. Zara's Christianity is configured as a prop. The cross she wears has the power to engender strong, effective responses in both her and others. Quote, "Yet far from having lost the reverence due, this cross, as often it meets by eye, strikes through my heart a kind of awful fear." End quote. The cross is the visual representation of both the act of Christ's sacrifice and a geographic link to Calvary, highlighting the play's geopolitics about the contested Holy Land, despite its dominant concern as a private melodrama. Yet the cross on Zara's bosom also draws attention to the materiality of the ideological debate. quote, the prop of all our Christian hope is lost. In Voltaire's text, the connection to both structural and theatrical properties is not there, which I would translate this line as the unhappy Christian's hope is betrayed. Des chrétiens malheureux, l'espérance est trahie. Both the cross she wears and Zara herself are properties. The cross is a theatrical object, or prop, worn by Zara, who is the metaphorical representative of the Christian slave's hope. Further, the cross hanging on a necklace renders visible Zara's inner Christianity even before she herself is aware of it. And it draws attention to Zara's body, the site of contention between Osman and Lusignan, her father. Desdemona's North African handkerchief and Zara's crucifix are visual and material manifestations, not just symbols, of the white woman's body as a site of intercultural contention. Zara also shares the tragic ending of Othello and Oroonoko, where the heroine dies after being stabbed by the man she loves, the archetypical she-tragic tableau. The character of Zara makes a potentially meta-theatrical reference to this in her death scene. As Osman approaches Zara, she speaks openly about the dramatic expectations of her audience. At last 'tis come, the feared, the murdering moment is come, and I am cursed by earth and heaven. Zara's own dramatic expectations vocalize the audience's expectations. Particularly one of the most frequently performed plays of the 18th century, the audience and Zara herself are expecting the outcome, made inevitable through both the generic conventions of she-tragedy and familiarity with the plot. Excuse me. So central to the she-tragic plot is the scene of sexual violation, sometimes consensual, sometimes not. While this aspect of she-tragedy is less prevalent in Othello and Zara, it is crucial to understanding Oroonoko as 18th century tragedy. So the Siege of Rhodes offers a useful comparison, particularly in its mise-en-scène. Rhodes tells the story of the final Ottoman conquest of Rhodes by Suleiman I in 1522, but the interpersonal plot at the center is adapted from Madeleine de Scudery's 1641 romance Ibrahim, or the Illustrious Bassa. Suleiman lusts after the Christian captive Iante, who is betrothed to his second-in-command Alfonso, which a character based on the real-life vizier Ibrahim. His wife Roxolana, the Ottoman Sultaness Hürrem, sets out to destroy her rival until Iante's virtue dissipates her jealousy. The distress of the city of Rhodes is conflated with Iante's distress, anticipating the way she-tragedy connects female suffering with domestic chaos. The relationship between Suleiman's imperial interests and his sexual interests is not metaphorical, but literal. The quest for territorial expansion becomes ultimately literally a battle for access to women's bodies. While linking military might to sexual prowess is not a process unique to this play, the slippage between military and sexual discourses obscures any division between the two. Alfonso describes the threat of Suleiman to his beloved Iante's virtue as this, quote, "The hardened steel of Suleiman is such, as with the edge does all the world command, and yet that edge is softened with the touch of Roxolana's gentle hand. And as his hardness yields when she is near, so may Iante's softness govern her." And the admiral responds, "The day sufficient seems for all address, and is at court the season of access. Deprive not Roxolana of her right. Let the empress lie with Suleiman at night. And as that privilege to her is due, so should Iante sleep at Rhodes with you." The admiral's concern with who is in which bed highlights how Alfonso's imaginings of Suleiman's marital governments mimic the description of ejaculation. The woman's sexuality is fought over and displayed by the play's male characters, to use Marsden's words, as the admiral and Alfonso assign Iante and Roxolana's respective sexual ownership in their absence, describing their political maneuvers as figuratively and literally erotic. The central anxiety in the Siege of Rhodes is that the sexual conquest will displace or outpace military conquest. The admiral's implication that Iante's overnight visit with Roxolana disrupts Suleiman's marriage bed calls attention to the sexual excess that later becomes synonymous with the stock character of Roxolana. The idea that Iante is taking the place of Suleiman in Roxolana's bed means that Iante is safe from neither Suleiman's sexual conquest, an anxiety explicitly stated in the text, nor from the implicit threat of female homosexuality. The harem, part of Roxolana's origins, is a spatial paradox of female homosexuality that, unlike a convent, operates for male sexual fulfillment. Describing Suleiman's military assault on Rhodes solely as a metaphor for assault is inadequate. The threat is not just what could happen to Ianthe and other Christian women should the Turks succeed, but also what may have already happened. The casting adds to this effect. Thomas Betterton, as played Suleiman opposite his wife Mary Betterton, herself an accomplished tragic actress, in 1661. The Bettertons' presumably consummated marriage means that sex between Solimante and Ianthe is fait accompli extratextually, even though within the narrative it is only a figment of Alfonso's imagination. The play's prevailing suggestion that the greatest threat to Ianthe has already been accomplished outlines an alternative narrative that follows the generic conventions of she tragedy closely. While the Siege of Rhodes does not include a raped or sexually transgressive woman in the narrative, the play stages a scene of violation nonetheless, as defined by Marsden. Quote, the ravished hair becomes the signifier of her violation, the ropes and gags certify to her helpless state, while a dagger, the symbolic representation of her violation, lies by her side. As Roxolana resolves to murder Ianthe in the seraglio due to her jealousy, the scene opens with a tableau that anticipates Marsden's mise en scène of violation. And so this is from the stage directions in The Siege of Rhodes. The scene is changed, being wholly filled with Roxolana's rich pavilion, wherein is discerned at distance Ianthe sleeping on a couch, Roxolana at one end of it, and Holly at the other. Guards of eunuchs are discovered at the wings of the pavilion. Roxolana having a Turkish embroidered handkerchief in her left hand and a naked poniard in her right. Ianthe is passively displayed in repose for the audience's gaze, in stark contrast to her refusal of the male gaze in her initial veiled entrance in the play. The naked phallic dagger as the weapon of choice suggests the act of rape. Roxolana's embroidered handkerchief evokes Desdemona's strawberry handkerchief, Othello's ocular proof of her violated chastity. She initially attempts to draw Ianthe near enough to kill by saying she has a kiss for Ianthe from Soliman, and as Roxolana exits, having been won over by Ianthe's sentimental performance, she gives Ianthe a kiss of friendship. The kiss, first identified as Soliman's, is consummated. The play stages a theoretical rape, enacting the tragic ending that it ultimately avoids. The Siege of Rhodes shows how the scenes of sexual violation that become crucial to later domestic tragedy is also at the center of play's staging cross-cultural encounter. While the exploration of difference is not explicitly along racial lines, the collapsing of the Oriental and the she tragedy manifests in tragedies that appear to follow more recognizably modern racial hierarchies. So in my final portion, I just want to show how in many ways Southerne's Oroonoko is a she tragedy. And in doing so, offering another explanation to the central question when discussing the afterlives of Behn's novella, namely, why does Imoinda become white? There are many theories to why Imoinda changes from Behn's enslaved black princess to Southerne's white heroine. Serenas Aravamadon, Lyndon Dominique, Derek Hughes, Severe Cole, Joyce Green MacDonald, Felicity Nussbaum, and many others have offered compelling reasons based on historical discourses of indentured servitude and chattel slavery, audiences' relationships with specifically female performers, Othello's precedent as a narrative of miscegenation, and other kind of historical or theoretical readings. But in addition to these interpretations, so I agree with almost all of those, but in addition to that, I also think that there is a generic reason for the white Imoinda's enslavement. And as I argue elsewhere, Restoration tragedy and the later 18th century, as I've discussed here, are generically defined by the suffering and the pathos of women. For Oriental tragedy in particular, the suffering of women is often based on captivity and enslavement, as is the case with Zara and Ianthe, as I've discussed earlier. Southerne's Oroonoko stands at a point where two different understandings of slavery and with those different understandings of race come into conflict. In Oriental tragedy, often based on events or tales from the ancient Mediterranean or the Ottoman Empire, enslavement is not an explicitly racialized institution, but one operating along lines of religious difference. Oroonoko takes place in 17th century Suriname, where the practice of chattel slavery was racialized and the enslaved were Black Africans. This is the form of slavery that would fundamentally shape the modern Atlantic world and produce the global African diaspora. Under the logic of the latter form of slavery, a white Imoinda is out of place at best, offensive at worst. But if understood as Restoration and 18th century tragedy in particular, her whiteness does not preclude her enslavement. This atonal class of history and genre makes visible the whiteness of the 18th century tragic heroine as exemplar. The genre based not just on the suffering of women, but increasingly on the sufferings of white women in particular. Aphra Behn's novel Oroonoko is presented as the eyewitness account of a woman in Suriname who recounts the story of the enslaved African prince who, after reuniting with his love Imoinda on a plantation, rebels so that his son may be born free. The uprising fails. He plans to die with Imoinda and their unborn child, but after stabbing her, he is captured. He meets his gruesome execution with stoicism that shows his true nobility. Behn's narrative may have become one of the bedrocks of the long 18th century survey syllabus and a frequent origin point for the rise of the novel thesis. But in the 18th and 19th centuries, it was Thomas Southerne's 1696 stage adaptation and many adaptations of that afterwards that was the more influential and well-known text. While much more can be said about race in this play, I want to focus briefly on a moment that highlights some of the she-tragic elements of Southerne's adaptation and how that in part contextualizes Imoinda's new whiteness. The governor's threat to Imoinda's virtue is one of Southern's major additions to Behn's narrative. Oroonoko and Imoinda have been separated after being sold to slave traders, and at the moment in the text that I will discuss right now, do not realize that they are both enslaved at the same plantation in Suriname. Imoinda, oh, I can weep, enough for you and me, if that will please you. The governor, you must not weep. I come to dry your tears and raise you from your sorrow. Look upon me. Look with the eyes of kind indulging love that I have full cause for what I say. I come to offer you your liberty and be myself the slave. You turn away, but everything becomes you. I may take this pretty hand. I know your modesty would draw it back, but you would take it ill if I should let it go. I know you would. You shall be gently forced to please yourself, that you will thank me for. She struggles and gets her hand from him. Then he offers to kiss her. Nay, if you struggle with me, I must take my life that I can part with freely. As in the Siege of Rhodes, Southerne stages a scene of violation, here implied forced masturbation, without dramatizing the act itself. Imoinda's enslavement renders her powerless in the face of this sexual threat, creating the situation for pity required for Restoration tragedy. As with Yante, though unlike tragic heroines like Rose Callista, Imoinda's violation is staged without being completed. The scene also invokes she-tragedy when the governor's lieutenants and Oroonoko enter, and we see the homosocial bonding and conflict over Imoinda's sexuality and her potential to be his mistress. Blandford says, you know she is our Lord Governor's, but if I could dispose of her, I would not now, especially to you. Why not to me? I mean against your will, her will. You are in love with her, and we all know what your desires would have. Love stops at nothing but possession. Were she within your power, you do not know how soon you would be tempted to forget the nature of the deed, and maybe act of violence. You after would repent. 'Tis godlike in you to protect the weak. Fie, would not force her. Though she be a slave, her mind is free and should consent. Such honor will engage her to consent, and then, if you're in love, she's worth the having. Shall we not see this wonder? Have a care. You have a heart, and she has conquering eyes. The insidious aspect of whiteness emerges here even as it is unstated. In the historical moment of both the original premiere and the subsequent revivals of the course of the following century, enslaved Black women could not consent. Imoinda's whiteness and her enslavement here are also marks of the Oriental tragedy in the play. Depictions of slavery in Oriental tragedy were not explicitly raced, because Ottoman slavery, particularly through the 16th century when many English depictions of the Ottomans are set, was not particularly operated on lines. Yante in the Siege of Rhodes and Zara in the Tragedy of Zara are both enslaved for part of the narrative. But the slavery of Oroonoko is very much the African chattel slavery of its contemporary moment. The stage Imoinda straddles these contexts, a character shaped by a more ambivalently race genre, but that also prefigures the consolidation of gendered racial hierarchies. Oroonoko's most important legacy may be its use as the first vehicle for the London Patent Theatre debut of the first great Black Shakespearean actor, Ira Aldridge, who in 1825 played Oroonoko in an adaptation of Southerne's own adaptation called The Revolt of Suriname, or The Slave's Revenge. A Black man performing with white women love interests, where previously had been white men in blackface, he would also marry somewhat later two white women offstage, though not at the same time. Aldridge would also play characters not differently raced like Lear and Shylock, but his legacy is undoubtedly centered on his performances as Othello and Oroonoko. As the title change suggests, Oroonoko became a crucial stage text in the discourse of abolition, and the critical conversation has justifiably focused on this context. The confluence of she tragedy and Oriental tragedy is crucial to understanding the seemingly more familiar but contradictory racial dynamics of the center of plays like Oroonoko, and with it the early performance history of Othello. As we move forward in 18th century theater studies, understanding the development of racial categorization will need to look not just towards the Desdemonas and the Imoindas, but the Ianthes, Zaras, and other exemplars of female pathos that ultimately created the circumstances where all suffering women are white. Thank you.
Thank you, Angelina. Thank you so much for that really wonderful talk. Let me share my video. Friends, so we can't do a proper round of applause because we're all so distant from one another, but what we can do is take to the chat and we normally do this at the end of a talk, just to register our sincere thanks to our speaker. If you haven't found the chat yet, then you need to head to the bottom right hand side of the page. You'll see a little kind of purple button there, and you'll be able to pull it across and you'll find the speech bubble which will allow you to register applause. It was a wonderful talk, Angelina, and it was so interesting to hear you start with reflections on what you've learned through teaching in a non-European, non-US, non-North American context, and how that has shaped your thoughts and your approach towards this material. That was just really, really fascinating. So thank you. Let me tell everybody assembled about different ways of asking questions, because we will move now into Q&A. So two different ways to do this. If you would like to, you'll be able to type your question into the chat, which many of you have already found. If you would prefer to ask your question using a mic and camera, you're more than welcome to do that. And you can either type question into the chat, or you can head down to the raise hand button, which you will find at the bottom of your screen next to the microphone and camera buttons down there. There's a little person raising their hand. So do feel free to do that at any point from now on. Either type your questions in or raise your hand. And I can see somebody doing that already. Lauren Denbovitz, would you like to ask your question?
That was so wonderful. Thank you, Angelina. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the other female characters in Oroonoko, Charlotte and Lucy, and even Widow Lackett, and how their whiteness registers or doesn't in relation to Imoinda, or how you understand the kind of split plot contributing to the formation of whiteness.
Yeah, thanks for that question. And I think it's interesting and not unrelated that those are the elements of Oroonoko that get dropped later in the 18th century. So what's interesting to me, as Oroonoko becomes a more explicitly, well, let me rephrase that. As Oroonoko becomes used for more explicitly abolitionist rhetorical ends, those extra women kind of drop out. And I think it's because, and so Felicity has written about this a lot, obviously, and I think I agree that part of it is Imoinda, the white Imoinda, in addition to these other women characters, are all kind of functioning under this kind of almost tainted whiteness, right? So Imoinda's association with chattel slavery in her position, the cross-dressing characters, the widow character, right? So widows are always this kind of complicated figure of sexually knowledgeable single women, right? And that kind of maps onto the actress as a figure, right? That the actress is explicitly racialized as white as a part of the way that she is gendered differently from the men who were playing women's parts before, right? So that in the way that her gender is not self-evident, right? It has to be asserted, and it's asserted with whiteness through her appearance as Desdemona. And I think this is also happening with all the other female characters that are happening, right? That as their kind of whiteness in contrast to Oroonoko is being established, it is also doing so through this kind of these various deviant portrayals of oh gosh, I like lost my train of thought in the middle through. So basically that in the same way that Desdemona's gender has to be racialized in order to be made legible, I also think that the gender of all these different women's characters in all of their different ways of deviance are also racialized through their kind of triangulation with this white Imoinda.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Question in the chat from Nush Powell. So Nush asked, I'd love to say a bit more about the racialization of women in Ottoman captivity depictions. I think you mentioned that race signifies differently in those narratives, and it's important to remember that Ottoman and Barbary captivity was raced. There's considerable evidence that captives taken from sub-Saharan Africa were treated very differently compared to European populations, although the European focus is not surprisingly on the experience of white captives.
Yeah, so I will definitely clarify this. It's not that there's not a racial element to it, but the status of captivity and enslavement is not raced in the same way that it is in European slavery. So you can be enslaved and still be European or white. It doesn't. I don't mean to suggest that there is no racialized difference within it, but the very fact of captivity in chattel slavery becomes raced in a way that you don't see in Ottoman slavery, in Middle Eastern slavery, that the relationship as that your enslaved kind of relationship will shift, and some of these roles in fact are explicitly race. So like the black eunuch and the white eunuch are official titles in the Ottoman harem. So to take Nush's point, right, it is explicitly raced, but the fact that you are a captive, and Roxolana Hurrem, the actual woman, right, many of the harem inhabitants were enslaved Eastern Europeans, right? So I guess for what I think what the white Imoinda is doing is it's taking the Ottoman kind of Oriental slavery where race might differ your role within enslavement or your experience of enslavement and captivity, but it doesn't define whether or not you can be enslaved in the same way that will be the logic under which chattel slavery will operate, one that is explicitly tied to the forcible removal and enslavement of Black Africans in particular.
Thank you. So I've got two. I'm gonna take Kerry's comment first and then go to Lisa's question, just because I think Kerry's comment picks up on your response to the last question. So Kerry, Sinanan comes in to the chat just to say, so a white Imoinda erases the race fact of chattel slavery ?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it erases it. I think it provides a kind of a dissonance to it, in that I don't think it is possible either now, or I would even argue in most of the 18th century, to ignore the race aspect of the racial aspect of it. I think you have these kind of two competing discourses that haven't fully, one has not fully superseded the other. That you have a genre that is dramatizing enslavement, that is operating on the logic of kind of Oriental slavery, right, that you see with Yonce and with Zara, and that is still being seen on stage frequently and repeatedly through the 18th century, right? So it's not even an older discourse, right? It is one that's continually being reenacted throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, right? Which is kind of the nature of performance. At the same time as a raced form of slavery, chattel slavery, is funding the very existence of this theater, right? It is at the basis of all kind of economic activity of the metropolis, right? So maybe it's papering order. I like the idea, maybe it's the musician in me, but I like the idea of dissonance more than anything, and that both are loud, both of these discourses are present and being continually reenacted at the same time, but it's not in a way that I think that either we, from this vantage point, or I would argue in the period itself, it's not one that is ever going to fully kind of harmonize, to continue to belabor the metaphor.
Thank you. Lisa A. Freeman.
All right. You can hear me and see me? Great. Hi, Angelina. It's great to see you, and thanks for such a terrific talk. I guess I wanted to ask you about one of the major sort of differences, say, between Othello and Oroonoko, and this is something I was puzzling through with my students when we read Southern's Oroonoko this semester, which is what puzzled them was the absence of any concerns about miscegenation, right, in the 17th century, whereas by the 19th century, right, the consolidation of race results in a sort of a fixation on the so-called problem of miscegenation, right? And so I'm wondering if you could kind of comment on how that, I guess this picks up on Carrie's question about chattel slavery, right? And then what happens to the sort of specter of pregnancy, the specter of reproduction, and how that actually operates or alters what we see, say, in an Oroonoko versus, say, in Othello, because it seems to me, you know, both in Bain's Oroonoko and in Southern's Oroonoko, right, that's like a key, for lack of a better word, oddity, right, of how the narrative organizes itself and the things that it's most concerned with. And so I'm wondering if you might comment on that, because I'm interested in tracing that problem as it moves through you know, play works across the 18th and 19th century. So just wondering if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, it occasionally comes up kind of as a specter, right? So in one of Oroonoko's final speeches, he kind of alludes to mixing with the body of Imoinda. And so while it doesn't, and it's not necessarily presented as something bad, right? It's this beautiful kind of tragic moment, but I do think that kind of that mixing vocabulary is not an accident, and of course the fact that that potential is foreclosed, right, by their deaths, right? So it's kind of raised and then hurriedly taken away. I also think that this is where the tragedy of Zara in particular can be helpful, because you're seeing a lot of similar relationships, but one in which Osman is not explicitly raced as Black or even other, right? He's religiously different, but you don't see a lot of the same concern about skin color. So I think when these plays are being read as kind of the same format and the same genre, which I argue that they are, almost every time Zara comes up in the record, it is kind of compared to Othello, right? And then when we see a lot of resonances between Othello and Oroonoko. So I think these plays are being triangulated together. And it's interesting that in one in particular, miscegenation is not a concern at all. That Zara's kind of relationship with her religious loyalties is still one of cultural difference, but it's not working in the same way that racial mixing is. So I don't have a fully kind of rationale for it, because I think much like with the kind of different discourses of slavery, I don't actually think it's fully reconciled in all of these plays. But I think reading Oroonoko as Oriental tragedy, as Oriental she tragedy, kind of helps clarify why miscegenation is not the kind of third rail that we see, and I think in later versions of Oroonoko becomes much more explicit, I think is also kind of an important distinction.
Great, thank you. And just to kind of pick up on that point, I can see that Lauren Dembowitz has written in the chat, hereditary slavery seems more central in Oroonoko than racial difference. Exactly, Imoinda's child will be enslaved, not because Oroonoko is black, but because pathos sequitur ventrum dictates that the child will follow Imoinda's status as enslaved. But then
yes.
So you do go ahead and respond to.
Well, I was just saying, that is, the Hortense Spiller's, argument of American grammar book, right? Mama's baby, Papa's maybe, right? That, again, the way that the white Imoinda experiences slavery in many ways does map onto what is happening with chattel slavery, but you just have this incongruity of her whiteness that kind of troubles, I think, what if she has remained black. I think it becomes much more legible, much clearer to us than this changed race stage. But absolutely, the logic of how Oroonoko's kind of crucial decision for kind of the murder-suicide pact, the rebellion against enslavement, all follows under the logic of what is very recognizably slavery in the Americas in the 18th and 19th centuries.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to go to David Taylor next, and then Eunson Lee, and then Elaine Mugger. I'm just trying to navigate between the hands up in the chat. So David.
Hi Angelina. Thanks for such a great talk. I was really, I suppose I found really compelling this idea of trying to track the she tragedy back far earlier to the Siege of Rhodes, and also think about how she tragedy and Oriental tragedy are kind of entangled. I found that really compelling. My question, and this comes from someone who's just spends too much time with Addison and Addison's Cato on his brain at the moment, but is about Cato as Cato obviously isn't a she tragedy, but its kind of romance subplot certainly has elements of the she tragedy about it. In many ways it aligns with the kinds of generic markers that you were noting. The prologue calls for Roman drops to be wept by the British audience, and of course you have Marcia, the daughter of Cato, being bound up in this rape plot where the character of Sempronius dresses as the African prince Juba, intending to force entry and to rape her. He's actually he's stopped, of course, by the real Juba. So there's lots of similar things going on there. The white female body being vulnerable sexually. There's also, again, this question of miscegenation, but something quite different as well that seems to be going on. I mean, also not least in that it is the Roman Sempronius who is rapacious and kind of almost ironically dies and complains as he dies about dying in kind of African garb, and it's Juba who is transformed into this kind of exemplary Roman figure, and obviously. Lisa, who has published a fantastic essay and also written about it in her book as well. But I just wonder how you felt. Does Cato exemplify a different kind of tragedy, or does Cato actually also fit in with a kind of story you're building?
So I would argue that plays like Cato actually kind of show how central she tragedy is to all 18th century tragedy. So if I'm feeling a little bit more provocative or ornery, depending on how terrible you want to be, I would kind of argue that all 18th century tragedy is she tragedy. In that I think that in trying to define what makes 18th century tragedy, especially in the perceived crisis of tragedy of the 18th century, what defines it generically is not just pathos, not just sentiment, but particularly the pathos and sentiment of women. So that you have plays, even like Cato, where it seems like the central conflict, the central interests are so different than the kind of domestic concerns of she tragedy, is still focused on the potential threat of or actual consummation of sexual violation of women in the performed distress. And how I kind of came to this idea is looking at the Siege of Rhodes in context of other adaptations of what I view as adaptations of Madeleine de Scudéry's Ibrahim. So like obviously Settle's Ibrahim, but also the Earl of Ori's Mustafa. So plays that are read as heroic drama, but when you compare them to their source material, you have a Roxolana in Scudéry who is not a character of sentiment. She is ruthless, she's, plotting, all of that stuff, right? You look at the adaptations of it, all of a sudden she becomes a character of pathos. So there's something about, to me at least, the shift from prose romance into staged performance that kind of requires the addition of this female sentiment, both in the character of Roxolana, but also in kind of auxiliary characters like the Queen of Hungary and Mustafa. So I think to say that, I think that even if the valence or the emphasis changes across plays, the more you kind of look at 18th century tragedy, the more female pathos in particular becomes central to it. And so that's where I think reading plays like Cato, plays like Oroonoko, as she tragedy in particular, helps kind of reveal the stakes of those plays and how they're interpreting feeling, and particularly gendered feeling. And that becomes important when you are seeing dramas of race like Oroonoko.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Great, thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to go over to the chat and take Yunsun Lee's question, or read it out at least. The question is, could you talk a bit about visual perception in the context of the stage? Was whiteness seen or perceived differently? That is, as familiar, as defamiliarized, exoticized? Was there something like a visual binary?
Yeah, I mean, it's always hard to know, right? With performance, we have, visual representations of, for like frontispieces from published plays, portraits, things like that. It's not always clear how much is this going to be a literal representation of what's happening on stage versus kind of a portraiture or visual interpretation of kind of what happens. So with that, I don't think there is a concrete or explicit visual vocabulary for whiteness versus non-whiteness. Obviously, you have something much more clear, like the blacking of the face with Othello and with Oroonoko, which I think it's pretty clear based on how these performances are talked about that is happening. If you look at representations of the Tragedy of Zara, which I believe I included in the slides, you don't see any darkening of Osman, or at least at the very in the 1730s when the play first appears. He's in a turban. You'll see kind of the Muslim crescent. With women, you'll see them often depicted in in variations of 18th century dress, but maybe with added kind of almost sari-like scarves, kind of the leopard skin print is sometimes given to Imoinda. Felicity Nussbaum has a kind of discussion of the different visual representations that Lyndon Dominic expands on, of kind of the different visual representations we get of Imoinda, the white Imoinda mostly. And it's interesting that in much of the same way that I think the discourse and how it's actually talked about on the stage is muddled, I think also the visual signifiers are not always clear. Also in the way that I think that's true of all costuming in the 18th century, right? That you had sometimes had an explicitly dated contemporary costuming, so not even necessarily 18th century fashion of the current moment, but kind of a staged version. Maybe you would have, additions of various accessories for different times and places. So I think in general, visual signifiers of anything on the stage are not in kind of strict categories or strict binaries. And I think when it comes to race in particular, that it becomes even more kind of amorphous.
Wonderful, thank you. And a final comment, I think, from Elaine Maguire, who says that thinking about the invention of whiteness in relation to Zara, it seems important that it is her European family who insists that there's an unbridgeable difference between Zara and Osman, a difference the two uncomplicated lovers in Act 1 don't see And then she also Elaine goes on to talk about An Old Field, moving between characters, moving between Marcia and Jane Shaw and back again. So another way to link them. I don't know whether you want to make a final comment in response.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, and this has been talked about by a lot of people, but the kind of not just the success of actors in general, but of actresses in particular is one reason why I think the performance of female pathos becomes definitional to 18th century tragedy, right? Giving these women in particular, these skilled women, these popular women, opportunities across tragic genres to display their skill, right? To perform in the way that is most appreciated by the genre, I think. And so absolutely, you can kind of do a lot of tracking between all of these different actresses in these various parts. And so just to kind of agree with Elaine's point, right? That you see these women who are very much famous for the performance of pathos going through heroic drama, domestic she tragedy, Oriental tragedy, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, I think what's crucial to the play of the Tragedy of Zara in particular is that for the central conflict to work, right? Absolutely, it's true that the European, the Christian family kind of see this as unbridgeable. But what makes it unbridgeable for Zara and Osman in particular, I think, is that these are two competing loyalties that have to be equally attractive for the tragedy to work, right? Osman has to be an equally valid choice or have at least an equally strong appeal to Zara's emotions as her Christian family, right? So marrying and remaining Muslim, right? Marrying the Sultan and remaining Muslim has to be an equal pull on her loyalties as her loyalties to her Christian families, right? That's what makes it a tragedy. That's what makes it irreconcilable to Zara and Osman, which is different than the irreconcilability that Elaine is talking about with the kind of unbridgeable gap, right? Now, what's interesting is when you look at kind of later adaptations of Zara, particularly kind of starting with Garrick's changes after the death of Susanna Cibber, who kind of had ownership over the Zara role for much of the century. Osman becomes less of a tragic figure in his own right, as I think he kind of operates in the Tragedy of Zara. It becomes, there's a lot more commonality with the kind of Oriental despot figure in later iterations of it than you see at the beginning. So much like Oroonoko, I think Zara as a text is not particularly stable in terms of how do we read how difference is working, because we have like 5 different versions of each of these plays through the 18th and into the 19th century. Ironically, given the controversies around Shakespeare scholarship, if anything, Othello is probably the most textually stable in performance in this period than Zara or Oroonoko are.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angelina. We are so grateful to you for your presentation, for your wonderfully rich Q&A. We were told at the beginning how good you are at asking questions, but you have shown us that you're really very wonderful at answering them as well, and we're very, very grateful to you. Friends gathered here, shall we just take to the chat to register our thanks to Angelina one more time? Thank you very, very much indeed. ODSECS takes a break in August, but we are back in September. On the 16th of September, Travis Chewing Lau of Kenyon College is going to be speaking to us under the title Cripping Enlightenment, Cripping Progress, and you can book on the ODSECS website in the usual way. There are some changes afoot for ODSECS in the autumn, so from that point, I am going to be stepping back from my position as introducer in chief, and I'm very, very delighted and really honoured and thrilled that an amazing collective of 18th centuryists have very generously agreed to step up and carry this seminar on through its next phase of life. So I'm particularly grateful to Elaine McGurr, who's going to be doing lots of the introducing in the autumn and further on, and also to Joseph Hone and Jason Pearl, Nush Powell, Kerry Sinanan and James Wood, who have all agreed to come and look after what I think for many of us has become a really precious online space of interaction and engagement and encouragement and sociability in these very, very difficult times. So many thanks to you all for being here today, and to so many of you for coming to these seminars so regularly. We're really grateful to you, and I hope that I hope to see many of you. I will be back. I'll be back as part of the audience rather than sitting where I am at the moment. Thank you very much, everybody. And in order to leave an ODSECS seminar, all you have to do is close the browser window. So Angelina, why don't you stick around just so I can have a quick chat with you if you've got a moment. Thank you very much, everybody else. Feel free to go whenever you're ready.